the fiasco in Leningrad with Byron Janis was unbelievable. First, we had a rehearsal, and Benny kept standing behind the lid of the piano.
Sorry, this is the last trip.
And Byron kept saying, "Mr. Goodman, I can't see you." Well, it wouldn't have helped because Benny wasn't conducting. He would play that opening bliss, you know, and then where the band is supposed to come in, you'd expect he would go like this. So it sounded like pebbles falling in the stream when the band came in. So Byron kept saying, "Mr. Goodman, you know, there are tempo changes here that you need to conduct, and oh, don't worry about it." So the whole first rehearsal was that kind of stop and start, stop and start. And we'll fix it tomorrow at the rehearsal where we set everything. Okay, but I want to make sure the piano is here because I have to be able to see, you know. And would you please have me on the first half of the performance because there's a night plane I can catch to get back to New York if I get out of here in time. Don't worry about it. Next day we get a message from Benny's manager that the rehearsal's been called off because Benny went fishing. Byron Janis wants to cancel the concert, of course. And the full weight of the State Department is put on him to not embarrass the United States. Please, you have to do this, you know. So as we get on the stage, we're assuming that Benny's going to put him on the first half. No, he does the regular first half that we do, introduce the band, play all the numbers that we normally play. Intermission, Byron Janis is backstage, ready, climbing the walls, you know. Don't worry about it, we'll get you out of here. So they put the piano on the stage. Now there are taped marks where the piano is supposed to go according to Byron. And Benny has to put it back a little farther so it won't be farther upstage than he is. Then Janis comes out and he whispers to Melanine. He says, "Watch my left hand. I'll make the tempo changes surreptitiously." So Benny starts out, squeak. Stops and fixes his reed. Squeak. Finally, he executes the gliss perfectly and gives us no downbeat at the top. So Byron brings the band in, and he probably played worse on that number than he'd ever played in his life since he was a student. He was so furious. He had a run that was supposed to go in opposite directions. It was the left hand's supposed to go down, the right hand's supposed to go up. His left hand started to go up, and he snatched it away like on the stove, and he just played it with one hand. And then finally, it comes to an end, and he gets out of there, and we're all just embarrassed for him and sorry that the whole thing has gone down. Then he wrote a scathing letter to Time magazine saying what a rude and humiliating experience that was. And then Benny's manager wrote a letter saying that, I think it was, there had been a news story about this, and then Janis had nearly walked out and all that. And then Benny's manager had written one of those things about everything was perfectly all right and blah, blah, blah. And then Janis wrote a letter saying that he had been really treated with such an unprofessional and rude way. So, but it was par for the course with Benny, you know. He wanted the music to be good, but he found himself in competition with his best soloists sometimes. Now, Zoot, he loved Zoot. Joe Newman, he loved Joe. So he let them play. But Phil, he was in competition with. Teddy, he was in competition with. I couldn't understand it. Very strange. And Jimmy Maxwell, now he insisted that Jimmy was like back from his old band, had been his lead trumpet player, and was a friend of the family. And Jimmy was doing the Perry Como show at that time. He didn't want to go on this trip. Benny offered him a whole lot of money. I have to have you for my lead trumpet. Oh no, Benny, I'm not well. I don't want to go. Yeah, well. Then a couple of days later, Jimmy calls Benny and says, I just got a call from General Sarnoff at NBC. What are you doing? You know, and telling him that he should go on the trip. And he said, well, I thought maybe he would convince you, you know. He said, well, look, your son is graduating from college, and he's graduating from high school. He's going to go away to college next year. You won't see much of him. Why don't you have this nice summer with him in Russia? You know, and that got to Jimmy. He thought that would really be nice. He says he can be the band boy. So I think Mel actually did show David how to take the drums apart, but he never did anything. He just came along, you know. And when we got to Moscow the first time, all of a sudden Jimmy is presented with a bill for David's food. Benny wasn't paying for the food. You know, the State Department was taking care of all this. But and he's like old family friend. He said, Benny, what are you doing? You know? And he got so mad, he says, look, I don't want to pay you this money. Tell them to give me a bill, and I'll pay them. So they gave him a bill, and it was $10 less than the bill Benny had. And then on top of that, he ends up having Jimmy play fourth by the time we get to Russia. So he was probably the most expensive fourth trumpet player. And Jimmy had suspicion. He brought a lot of cash along with him, and because he was afraid he might have to bail out on this trip, and he had arranged with his wife to send him an emergency telegram if he needed to bail out. So he called her one day and he said, I think I want to get out of here. You know, we're only about 2 weeks into the 6-week tour. So she sends him a telegram and says, the dog died, the cat died, everybody died, come home. But by that time he had worked out his problem with Benny, so he stayed.
What about the great story you were talking about a little bit with the Jerry Mulligan's quartet and Bob Brookmeyer? That must have been just some heady days.
Well, it was. I met Bob at Flores' apartment. He had a place on 72nd Street in those days when he was a New Yorker. And Bob and Winston Welch had come in from Kansas City and were hanging around New York and looking for places to play. And so we met at Med's place, and I thought, oh man, am I glad I gave up the valve trombone last year, because I would have had a heart attack trying to play like this guy. So Jimmy Rainey got me on Stan Getz's band. It was just supposed to be a week in Boston, and Jimmy was going back with Stan, who had been on the West Coast. And he said, hey, you want to do this? He asked me to bring a bass player. Roy Haynes was living in Boston, and so he was the drummer, and a wonderful piano player from Pittsburgh, who later drank himself to death, named Jerry Kaminsky. He played like Hank Jones, angelic player, and he couldn't believe anybody liked the way he played. It was like, oh, you know, always depressed. He was on Terry Gibbs's band one time, and Terry came backstage and said, hey Jerry, there's a guy out front that just thinks you're the reincarnation of Christ, you know. He said he never heard anybody play as well as you do. He wants to meet you. And Jerry says, no, one guy.
What?
So anyway, I got to be with Stan Getz. He asked me if I wanted to stay on the band, and I said, sure. I had just been playing the bass about a year, you know. And Jimmy was teaching me the changes, and it was really nice. And so we came and played Birdland, and went down and played in Philadelphia. And, Roy Haynes stayed in Boston, so Frank Isola became our drummer then. And then we got we thought we had a week off, and Stan called me up and said, hey, we're going into Birdland, they got an opening. So I go down there, and there's Kenny Clark setting up. And I said, oh, Frank must have been busy, you know. So second set, I see Frank sitting down in the peanut gallery. And I said, hey man, what happened? He says, I don't know, I turned on the radio and found out I was fired. Duke Jordan replaced Jerry, and for a while it was Duke and Fluke and me and Jimmy Rainey. And then Jimmy got a job with Jimmy Lyons over at the Blue Angel, and we just became a quartet with Stan. And then Duke and Klute got a gig with somebody else and abandoned Stan, and he looks at me and said, well, I guess I better start a new band. So he said, you know any good guys, you know? And I said, well, you looking for another guitar player? He said, no, it could be anybody. I said, well, how about Brookmeyer? And he said, yeah, I heard him play so and so and so, let's try that. So he got Johnny Williams on piano and Alan Levitt on drums, and me and Brookmeyer. And we got this nice little band together, and we did a couple of records. But somehow that rhythm section never really gelled. I got the feeling that John Williams wanted to be in front of the center of the beat, and Alan liked to lay back. And I felt like I was in the middle here. So their solution was to fire me and get Teddy Kotick back with Stan before. And it probably turned out all right anyway, because the band fell apart when they went to the coast and got into a lot of trouble and all. And I stayed in New York and found my way to people like Jerry Wald, different jobs around town, until I finally got lucky with, well, actually, when I first came off of Stan's band, I went into Charlie's Tavern, and there was Winston Welch, who was now with Claude Thornhill. And he said, Jesus, are you doing anything? Our bass player just got another job. I said, I know, he just took mine. And so he said, well, let me call Claude, you know, so he did, and I was hired. And I stayed with them for that whole summer, doing one-nighters with the Thornhill band, which was a lovely experience. Well, I can tell the bass players a story that wouldn't mean anything to anybody else. I was self-taught. I was a valve trombone player on this summer job in 1950, and they wouldn't hire a bass player, and the drummer couldn't stand it, so he went out and rented an old cave for the summer from some kid that had left it on the bandstand. He said, when you're not taking a chorus, you got to try to play the bass. I can't stand this, you know. So by the end of the summer, they had gaslighted me into playing the bass. Now, they didn't know how to tell me how to play, but they certainly knew how to tell me what they wanted to hear. They said, you know, listen to Ray Brown, listen to Oscar Pettiford, and listen to Jimmy Blanton, you know, records. And then they would tape record every night and call me up and say, here, this 8 bars, you sound right, you know, sound like a bass player. By the end of the summer, I'd found my way around on the thing well enough. They knew how to tell me how to tune the thing. But I didn't know there was such a thing as a sound post in there. Nobody had ever told me anything like that. The height of the bridge was the height of the bridge, you know, there it was, and I had these strings. So I came back off of that job. Now I could play the bass well enough. I could hear bass lines. I had good ears. I'd been a good harmony singer when I was a kid and all that. So I would stand around Charlie's Tavern hoping for something to turn up that would put some food in my mouth. And somebody would come in and say, hey, I need a bass player for Saturday night. I'll take it. And then I would run over to Noah Wolf's on 6th Avenue. He had an old beat-up bass that he would rent for $5 for the weekend. And then I would go down to Jack Silver's and rent a tux for $5 for the weekend. And the job maybe paid $15 or $20. But in those days, you could live on that, you know. So the whole fingering system that I had worked out involved just grabbing the strings as hard as I could grab them. And I had a bad hand. I'd run this hand through a window when I was a kid. Somebody slammed a door in my face. And it had cut all these tendons and one nerve. And I was trying to play the saxophone at the time. I couldn't play it anymore because I couldn't feel whether I had those keys under my fingers or not back there. So the actual playing of the bass brought this hand back to where but I was not using this finger because it was numb. I was using this finger a lot. was wrapping my thumb around for strength because the action was high on his bass. And I would just play like 4 notes up the E string until I came to the A, and then I'd play up the A string until I came to the D, and I would go up the G string as far as I could find the pitches. And as long as I could make up my own notes, I could play lines. I was fine. If somebody wrote something out for me to play, I was in trouble because I had no fingering system. I didn't know there was one. So on Claude Thornhill's band, all of a sudden, instead of making up my own lines, I'm reading parts. And Claude had a theme song called Snowfall that had a repeating bass line that went through a 10th in D flat. No open string. And I wanted that to sound legato, and I couldn't figure out how to, I was shifting for every note. What in the world? How come everybody else doesn't look like they're working as hard as I am? So I went and sat in my hotel room the second day that I was on that band and thought about it until I finally figured out if I would make a shift, I could do it in 2 shifts rather than in 5. And that brought my hand around in the right position, and 6 months on that band, my hand was in such much better shape than it had been. Then I went to work with Marion McPartland at the Hickory House. That was my first good job in town. And she liked to play in all the hard keys. She modulated constantly, and that really gave me some exercise. It was like practicing every night. I wasn't a good practicer by myself. I figured out a way I would leave the bass in the middle of the room in this tiny apartment where I lived, and I'd trip over it all the time, so I would occasionally pick it up and finally, when I left Marion to go with Jerry Mulligan's sextet, it was kind of a reciprocal recommendation from Bob Brookmeyer, since he had gotten me fired off of Stan Getz's band, that he got me onto Jerry's sextet. And when I got there, I discovered that Jerry had some parts written out that started in the upper register, and I was making chalk marks on the fingerboard to try to figure out how to get those notes in tune. I had no system. So the only guy that had ever mentioned to me that he was studying the bass was Trigger Albert. He had his job over at CBS. And I called him up and said, "Trigger, who's your teacher?" And thank God he said Fred Zimmerman. Fred was the principal bassist with the Philharmonic at the time, and probably the best teacher in town. And so I made an appointment with Fred, and I went over there. I had a French bow in those days. And he said, "Well, take your bow out and play me something." I said, "Fred, I own a bow, but I only use it for the last note." He says, "And you're a working professional?" I said, "Oh, yeah." I said, "I play pizzicato most of the time, you know." "Oh, I see." He said, "Well, I tell you what," he said, "let's start with page 1 of the Simandl book, and when we come to something you already know, it'll go faster." We won't miss anything. Well, God bless Fred. He developed a fingering system and a bowing technique that I had never suspected before. And I remember one time he called his wife in from the kitchen. He said, "Listen to him play this, play that again." And I played this thing. He says, "Isn't that beautiful?" And he's not even serious. That meant that I didn't want to be in the Philharmonic. But he was a great help, I must say. And then I'm glad I've lived this long as a bass player, because I'm still figuring stuff out. You know, there's still things that I say, "Oh, you know, my hand is able to do that. Isn't that nice?" You know, and I got to where I can practice, and I feel a little more sure of my technique. You know, but just that whole period of going from band to band and rhythm section to rhythm section, it was like going to school every night and being paid for it. It's really nice.
Jerry Mulligan, what kind of guy was he?
Oh, Jerry was interesting guy, very talented guy, and very self-centered guy. Bob Rosengarten lived near him up in Connecticut. He said, Jerry comes over once in a while, but he brings his own records for us to listen to. Because I have to tell him to go home once in a while. But I tell you, I had an odd relationship with Jerry because I really, well, the first job he called me for was a sextet with Zoot and Brookmeyer. You know, how could you turn that down? And John Erdley and Dave Bailey. And the music was so good. God, I couldn't believe I was lucky enough to be standing there participating in it, you know. And then I would get into these ridiculous arguments with Jerry about him being a genius. That's not the way we should be going, you know. We should be talking about this group experience that we're all having that's so wonderful, you know. And he wanted this special set of rules for the genius that didn't apply to everybody else in the world. So after we, you know, I would be with that group. I was with the sextet for a while, then it became a quartet when Zoot left, and then he gave me some kind of lecture one night about not trying hard enough, and I got insulted and quit. And about a year later, he called me up and said, well, I'm putting this new quartet together with Art Farmer. You want to be in it? And, of course I want to be in it, you know. So I stayed with that until Art left. And then another year or so later, he called me up and wanted to know if I wanted to replace Buddy Clark in the concert jazz band. Of course I did. And that was probably the hottest experience of my life because the band was so good and everybody was feeling so positive. I mean, they had to deal with Norman Granz that would keep the band together. And I mean, we would play a set and then get off and talk about the band for a half hour and couldn't wait to get back on the set. Nobody would send in a sub, even if it was for twice as much money, you know. It was just, we were just all so excited about that band. And then we got word that Norman Granz had sold Verve and was no longer supporting the band, and Jerry looked at his schedule and saw that we had nothing booked for a month, and he had the band on salary. He said, I can't afford this, you know, so he broke it up and we went back to being a quartet. And then every 6 months or something like that, even though we rehearsed once a week just for fun, he would get a couple of weeks of Birdland and a record day. But it killed the esprit de corps, you know. If Clark had another call, he'd send in Thad Jones or whatever. Phil would send in Gene Quill, you know. And it always was a good band, but it just wasn't that thing that it was for a couple of months there. That was probably the sun really came out for me with that band.
Would you remember about what year?
I have it written down at home, but let me see if I can think back now.
Oh, the 60s.
It was 62 was the Goodman tour, and we'd already had the band there for a while, so probably 60, 61 in there, maybe 59 even.
You came to my college in 1960 with Dave Bailey and Art Farmer and Jerry.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was, I'm almost positive 1960.
Okay, well then the concert jazz band was after that.
Oh.
So I've lost the dates. But that was sure some good band.
It's fine if some of you folks would like to ask some questions. Maybe in a couple of minutes we'll have him play something with Bill, which I know you'd like to hear him play.
Yeah.
And for some of you younger folks that are in here, if you have a few minutes to talk with him when we're done here, do so, because I mean this is one of the legends. I mean, I have been following this guy since I was a teenager, and I'm 71. And I have many recordings as I can get my hands on that he is on, all the Jerry Mulligan stuff. And if you don't have the Marion McPartland stuff with Joe Morello, because Joe was with Bill and Marion before the David Brubeck days, so they're It was marvelous.
Oh, yeah, we had a 6 nights a week job at the Hickory House on 52nd Street. That was really nice, the three of us.
Any questions? You guys have any
I
questions?
remember an article in Downbeat in the 60s that referred to the birds of the base, crow, swallow, and
Peacock. Yeah. Yeah, we thought we should do an album with Hawk. Maybe Donald Bird.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm just interested, how much did Zero charge you for lessons?
$10.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah, well, when I first came here with my valve trombone, I had eyes to study, and I, again, didn't know who was teaching jazz except Lenny Tristano. So I called him up. He was living out in Flushing then. And I had found a job. I knew how to feed a printing press from high school, and that was what I was making a living. I had a job up in the Bronx for $30 a week, and Lenny charged 10. And I was also seeing a psychiatrist for 10. I was paying $6 a week for a furnished room, so it shows you how much I had left for food and transportation. But I would come home after work on Tuesdays, whatever it was, and take the subway all the way out to Flushing and then a bus out to Lenny's house, and I would be his last student. And he was always running overtime and he taught long. So a lot of times I'd have to sit there between half an hour and an hour while he finished up with 1 or 2 students. And the last couple of times that I went there, he was in the bathtub during my lesson, getting ready for a gig at Birdland. Okay, play the next day part. So I kind of got the feeling that he didn't really feel too excited about teaching. But anyway, the job at the print shop got to be so miserable. They were just terrible people. They expected perfection for $30 a week, and they yelled constantly. And if I was singing my music lesson while feeding the press, they would complain that the noise bothered them. So I just quit the job. It was a nice spring day, and I came out to go to work, and I looked at the trees budding and the birds singing. I said, I can't go there today. So I had met Dave Lambert, who was scuffling in those days. He had a very cheap place to live down on the Lower East Side. So instead of walking to the subway, I walked over to the river and all the way downtown, over to the Lower East Side, knocked on Davey's door. And there was so much fun going on at his apartment. He had a 4-year-old daughter, and a lot of musicians came by, and a lot of artistic people and all that. I ended up staying there for about 2 weeks. Never went home. I finally went up to get a change of clothes. And my roommate, a drummer that I was sharing this $12 a week pad with, was packing up my stuff to put it in the basement. He said, I didn't know what happened to you. I said, I just lost track of time. But I said, I don't have any money because I'm not working. So maybe I can leave a suitcase here, like in escrow. I left some old army shoes and stuff, and they kept it in the basement there until I got up the $12 that I owed them, I think, which took me another 3 months. But God bless Davey, he taught me first how to scuffle, how to get along with no bread, and also that it didn't make you a bad person to be poor. And he had all of these strategies, you know, how to get a free fish at Fulton Market. If a guy came in with a catch of fish and you asked him for one, it was bad luck not to give you a fish, you know. So, or we would find jobs babysitting for friends, or painting apartments, or helping people move, or fixing their cars, or Al Capp's brother Jerry had a car that he couldn't park in his neighborhood in the 90s. So we would keep it in the village, and we would drive it around, and whenever he needed it, he'd call us, and we'd fill it up with gas and wash it, take it up and deliver it to him. It was very handy for him, and it helped us out a lot. So, little strategies like, we painted the front of Charlie's Tavern one day. Charlie said, "Hey, Tavern's looking crummy, it needs a paint job." He says, "If I give you the paint and $50 a piece, will that do it?" Oh, I found money. And, so we went in after the job, and Charlie bought us both a beer, and Davey immediately did a handstand on the bar and drank the beer upside down. And somebody took a picture of that, and when I was putting my website together, I had an old picture of Charlie's Tavern being torn down, and I put it on the website, and Charlie's daughter got in touch with me. She said, "I was surfing the web and found your picture in your website, and I just wanted to know if you would like to have some pictures of Charlie's Tavern when it was in its heyday." I said, "I'd love to." So she sent me these beautiful pictures, one of the outside and two of the inside, and I put those on the website. And then as I got it on the screen, I noticed that he had a wall full of pictures of people, 8x10s, that people would give him, he'd frame and put on the wall, and all musicians. So I looked at this one picture right next to Kay Kaiser, and I said, "I recognize that picture." I blew it up, and it's a picture of Davey doing the handstand and me handing him the beer.
Would you like to hear some music?
Yeah.
Well, this is almost as far as I would drive to play with Bill. I don't get a chance to very often these days, but I'm really happy that he's here. I haven't been in Rochester since 1950, 51, something like that. I was with Teddy Charles's trio, and there was a place up here called Squeezer's Bar. Joe Strazzeri was his real name. And there was some famous organ player that used to play up here. I can't remember his name. But I remember when we were playing behind the bar, there was a little box up in the wall behind the bar. And I see there's a couple of screw eyes, these huge, heavy duty, in the ceiling. I said, "What's that for?" He said, "Oh, that's for the goofers when they're in here with their trapeze." There was this group out of Washington, D.C., all very good musicians, that all played hanging up and down, upside down on the trapeze, including the bass player. They'd get up there and they'd hand him the bass and he'd do a solo. It was like, very funny musicians, but they're all...
Squeezers.
Yeah, Squeezers. Well, what do you have in mind to play?
Well, we've been talking about Mulligan, and he always used to love to play My Funny Valentine. I know you played that with him a lot.
Oh, I should
Remember
say
that arrangement he had?
Oh, yeah.
That very specific
How could I forget?
intro that he was, he used to bust my chops about playing that exactly. I just wanted to ask you if you ever heard Jerry use that line. He never said this to me, but another pianist. He said, "Would you please simplify your solos because they're getting in the way of my background."
Yes.
Yeah, he was serious.
He said, well, that was really what he loved about the quartet. He played backgrounds so well
Beautiful.
that he set up an entire harmonic relationship there with so few instruments. It was brilliant. Yeah, he said to me one time, he said, how come you're playing sevenths and ninths? I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, those are my notes.
Yeah.
You're supposed to be playing roots and fifths." And I said, "Yeah, but I'm making a line, you know, I'm looking for melodic lines."
Yeah.
And, but I said, what I'll do is I'll pay attention to what you're playing and try to stay out of your way and stay in the same direction. Maybe that'll work. So we worked out a thing where we would play tenths, lines in tenths that were really quite nice, and it would imply a lot of other notes that you didn't really hear. But
Yeah. And a pianist would get in the way of that.
oh yeah,
I love the pianist quartet.
yeah.
You know, I have a question because I've never really heard the true story. Do you know how the pianist quartet came into existence? Was that an artistic decision on his
Well,
part?
it was
or-
partly, I think the Hague either had no piano at the beginning or a rotten piano. And he was looking for some way to have the smallest group he could have that he would still be able to harmonize behind. So he needed another horn. And so he figured he could do without the piano, and he tried it. And it was just, there was a guy named Dick Bach that lived out in California then, who came in and just thought that the quartet was the best thing he'd ever heard. Where can I buy a record? And Jerry said, we haven't recorded this group. He said, well, how much does it cost to make a record? And they said about $300, which it was in those days. So Dick went out and created
Pacific Jazz.
Pacific Jazz Records so that he could have a record of that quartet.
Wow. Was that how Chet Baker got involved too?
Yeah,
Yeah, because I know he knew Bach.
yeah. Well, Chet was part of that quartet. Jerry found him there. He had played with Bird when Bird was out there, and well, Jack Sheldon said Chet drove them all crazy because all of the hard things that they were trying to learn from Dizzy and Miles and everybody working on it so hard, and Chet just put the horn in his mouth and played it without any effort at all. And he said it was so easy for him, he didn't have any respect for it, you know. He was more interested in hot cars than he was in playing the trumpet. But he did it so well. Somebody said to Jerry one time, I understand that Chet doesn't know anything about harmony. And Jerry says, he knows everything about harmony, he just doesn't know the names of the chords. You want to try that song?
Let's try it.
Thank
Thank